All right. Well, I'm James Swift, founder of Uncommon Journalism. We have a very special guest with us today, Mr. Brian Tuohy, who is an author who is the publisher of two books, The Fixes In and Larceny Games. He also made lots of media appearances. Just tell us about yourself, sir.
Well, I basically how I got into this was being a disgruntled fan. I was a fan for a very long time of sports and all their facets, and after a while, I got tired and fed up with knowing that the leagues were lying to me and lying to me about drugs in the game, criminals playing the game, gambling that surrounded the games, and I wondered if they were lying to me about everything that surrounded all of this, were they being truthful about the product, which is the games themselves? And as I started to dig into this subject matter, the more and more I began to believe that no, they weren't being honest to me about the games, that they were actually manipulating these games. Not all the games, but every once in a while manipulating games to get certain outcomes that were more profitable to them than other outcomes may have been.
Okay, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with your work, you have a central thesis I think all sports fans have at least molded at one point or another. And that's the idea that professional sports might be taking the pro wrestling approach. That is, the NFL, Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, all may be fixing their games to behoove themselves financially or for TV deals. So, as far as the NFL goes, why have you selected them to be the focus of your campaign?
Well, they're the focus because they're the big one. I mean, they're number one in terms of sports. They have the most fans, they have the most revenue. I mean, they make over $10 billion a year, and the next closest league is probably Major League Baseball now, which is I think makes about $6 billion, which is what the NFL makes in TV rights alone.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to go after them because they seem to be the focus. I mean, the World Series is a big deal to some baseball fans, but the Super Bowl, I mean, it's a national holiday now. So I mean, that's why I seem to pick on the NFL most, is because they're the biggest kid on the block.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, what incentives would the NFL have to fix their own games? What's the big premise behind that?
Well, I think it really actually stems going all the way back to Super Bowl three, and that's when there was two rival leagues, the NFL and the AFL, and they were merging together. And what happened was, is the NFL had about three times as many fans as the AFL did, and NFL fans were not accepting of NFL football, or AFL football, I should say. They deemed it subpar, and there was literally billions of dollars at stake for the owners if this merger failed. And I think they rigged Super Bowl three to lend legitimacy to the AFL, and they did it again in Super Bowl four to make sure that the merger happened and make sure it made everybody money. And I think they learned a trick way back when and kind of pushed it along and continued to use this whenever they needed it. Because let's face it, I mean, I don't believe a multi-billion-dollar industry, any multi-billion-dollar industry, you name it, leaves its product up to chance when in fact it can't control it. And the fact of the matter is the NFL and all these leagues can't control their own games. I mean, there's no legal reason that's preventing them from doing this. There's no law that stops this. So if the leagues can do this, why wouldn't they do this? I just think they don't do it all the time. I just think they do it when they see certain profit and motive attached to these things because they have the means to do it.
Yeah, and obviously this playoff season in particular, we've had a lot of peculiarities with the Dallas no call and then the reception on fourth down that was overturned, and now we have Deflategate. So, just in your years of covering the National Football League, what would you say are perhaps the greatest indicators that the game may be predetermined?
Well, I think if you just watch the game, I mean, I think if fans take that fan hat off and look at these games objectively and understand this is a big business, the games are their product. And when you see that and you see things that happen within these games, like the things you mentioned, I mean, the bad call in the Detroit Dallas game, the questionable call in the Dallas Green Bay game, the collapse even of the Green Bay Packers against the Seattle Seahawks, you see things that seem to be random and seem to be haphazard, but yet all these things end up benefiting the leagues. I mean, they seem to be doing well because of these supposed mistakes, and I don't think they're mistakes because I think when you see things that happen, especially with instant replay, and you see replays where it's a question whether a guy is inbounds or out of bounds, and when you watch it on your HD TV at home and you see clearly that the guy is in bounds, but yet the referee comes out onto the field and tells you he was out of bounds, or if you see like in the Des Bryant play, most everybody seems to indicate that he caught the ball without a doubt, and yet the NFL comes out and says no, he didn't catch the ball. Well, then I think you have to wonder, why were these supposedly bad calls made? Maybe they're not really bad calls, but they're this form of manipulation that I'm talking about that will alter the outcome of games and actually make more profit for the NFL.
Now, is the idea to make the games more competitive so you'll have more fourth quarter ratings or some other mechanism?
I think it's a little bit of everything. I mean, the NFL created this idea of parity way back in the 1960s. And the idea of parity was that it made all teams basically even. And that way, on any given Sunday, one team could beat another team. A great team could beat a bad team could beat a great team. It doesn't matter. They created this idea and this illusion of parity. And I think within that, it gives them the room to manipulate these games. Now, like you say, sometimes I think in the case of certain Super Bowls, they've manipulated games to ensure people watch into the fourth quarter because that makes the TV networks happier, makes the advertisers happier. It benefits everybody involved. But in other cases, I do think they've outright fixed the outcome of a game to make certain teams win over other teams because it pushes these storylines through and it continues them on longer than they naturally should occur. And I mean, an instance of this, in my opinion, is when the New Orleans Saints won the Super Bowl after Hurricane Katrina. I mean, the NFL created this whole hoopla about how this team supposedly rebuilt this city, and then suddenly this team that was for 40 years horrible, where the fans were most known for wearing bags over their heads, suddenly they became not just a Super Bowl contender but a Super Bowl champion and revitalized the city. And then the very next year, this team was destroyed by what they called Bounty Gate, and the Saints haven't really been heard from since. I mean, I think the league uses teams and uses players as like a cog in a bigger machine, and that machine is just geared to make profit.
And what would be the underlying mechanics of a thrown NFL game? Would it have to be just one referee taking calls, a quarterback intentionally throwing a game, a coach making intentionally bad calls, or what?
I think it's all the above. I mean, I think the easiest way to do it is through the officials because the officials are employees of the league. And if the league tells the officials, we want you to do your job in a certain way, it's merely an employer telling an employee how to do their job. And if that is manipulated in the game, and Tim Donaghy, the disgraced NBA referee, kind of alluded to this, that the league told them how to officiate games without outright telling them to fix games, just said, hey, give this player more room to operate, look for these certain calls. That can alter the outcome of a game in a certain favor of a certain team. But I think, organized crime, and that's one of the things I investigated in larceny games, was game fixing from a gambling end. Organized crime and gamblers have known how to get to players and know how to get to coaches and referees as well. Because, I mean, these are humans. They have weaknesses. They have gambling problems, addiction problems, you name it. If you can exploit that and then you can make money off it, you can get these players and coaches to do what you want. And it's only got to be a one-time thing. I mean, it doesn't have to be some massive conspiracy that involves the league, the advertisers, the networks, everybody. I mean, only a certain select few people really need to know in order to alter the outcome of a game. And I think it happens more often than people would realize.
And I think this season especially, you really haven't had a person as vilified in the sports world as Mr. Roger Goodell. So since he came in after the Pete Rozelle and Paul Tagliabue era, how has he personally changed the game?
Well, I don't think he's necessarily changed the game in and of itself. I mean, I think what's interesting with Goodell is he has no background in anything else but the NFL. I mean, he wouldn't be hired as a CEO of any other company. I mean, he just wouldn't, because all he's known is he started as a driver for Pete Rozelle and worked his way up to the ranks of now the commissioner of the National Football League. And I think you see that kind of ineptitude built into him. But at the same time, despite his haphazard rulings and suspensions and fines and whatnot that he's dished out to players and even owners, you notice he works for the owners. The owners employ him. And they could easily get rid of him and find somebody else, probably even somebody more qualified than him, but they keep him around. And I think that's the big question is, why do they keep him around? And they must keep him around because they think he's doing an effective enough job for the owners, and that's what it all boils down to. It's the owners that really run the league. Goodell is just merely the PR. He's almost like the President of the United States. I mean, technically Congress should run things, and the President's almost the figurehead. That's the same thing with Goodell, but everybody blames Goodell for this corruption within the sport. It's actually the owners that people should be really looking at.
Okay, and what would be the impact of game fixing on the business of the National Football League? And this is very sort of prominent of thing going on in Atlanta right now, not just with the NFL, but also Major League Baseball with getting the new stadiums financed. So how would this sort of tie into perhaps the development deals of the National Football League?
Well, I think it's really interesting that it's in baseball as well as the NFL, is that teams that seem to need, quote unquote, need new stadiums find the way to get the money to get these new stadiums. And a lot of times it comes along with success. And it's very odd. I mean, you can go back through the history of the NFL and Major League Baseball, and you can see teams that need stadiums suddenly get very good. They get their stadiums, and maybe they're good a little while longer, then they disappear. Or at the same time, as soon as, people, taxpayers basically approve new stadiums, a team will get good when it was bad. I mean, it's interesting that there seems to be a correlation, and it can't just be because of the playing surface and the dugouts and the locker rooms have changed. It's something that's more meaningful to the leagues, that these teams that need stadiums get these stadiums, and I think they kind of manipulate and influence that in occurring. Because, I mean, in reality, professional sports, and it's been proven by economists, really don't bring anything to the cities that supposedly need these stadiums and need these teams. In many ways, that.
Oh goodness, we have a drop in the game here, unfortunately.